Welcome to the FarmBits podcast.
FarmBits is proudly produced by the Nebraska Digital Agriculture team and hosted by students at the University of Nebraska.
The FarmBits podcast comes to you each week to discuss the trends, the realities, and the value of digital agriculture.
Through interviews with experts, producers, and innovators from across the agriculture industry, we hope that you step away from each episode with new practical knowledge of digital agriculture technology.
Hello, FarmBits followers, and welcome to another episode of the FarmBits podcast.
I'm Jackson Stansel.
And I'm Jose Cesario.
And we are glad to have you with us as we welcome Dr. Andy Little, Assistant Professor in the School of Natural Resources at the University of Nebraska, to the FarmBits podcast.
In this episode, we get into the topic of precision conservation, which is essentially using data to make more informed, localized conservation management decisions.
This is a really interesting topic in digital agriculture right now, and one that we have gotten several questions about. So let's dive in as Andy discusses his current research and the state of precision conservation with us. Would you mind telling us a little bit about your background and just how you got into your current position here as a faculty member at UNL?
Absolutely. Yeah. So first off, again, thanks. I really appreciate the opportunity to come. And so, my position here at the university is Assistant Professor of Landscape and Habitat Management. I'm 60% extension, 40% research. It's a really unique position in that I'm engaging a lot with our projects that we have with people on the ground. And so I'm interacting with producers, landowners, and addressing these conservation needs that we have. And so I ended up, not to go too far back in time, but basically I got my bachelor's degree at Penn State University, ended up in fisheries and wildlife management, and then moved and got my master's in Mississippi State in basically the same field, fisheries and wildlife management, working on white-tailed deer. Looking especially at how hunting pressure affected deer movements during the hunting season.
Was that the deer lab down at Mississippi State?
Yes, it was. Okay. Yes, it was. Yep, down at the deer lab. Cool. Yep, that's right. And so my research is actually out in South Central Oklahoma, even though I was going to school there in Mississippi. So I'd go over to the Noble Research Institute, which is a big ag research institute, who was basically helping to support our project with their lands out there in Oklahoma where we were doing the study. And so I left there. I worked at Ducks Unlimited as a GIS technician for several months and basically helped manage a bunch of the GIS data sets that they had in the South Central region of the country, and working a lot with our biologists down there and as they worked with landowners and helping them, enroll folks into wetland conservation programs and such. And then I took off and moved over to Georgia and got my PhD over there working with wild turkeys. So kind of switched it up a little bit, but I'm always been in this game species realm. I have a lot of interest. I grew up hunting and fishing. It's been a strong passion of mine. And so, really that kind of birthed that interest to kind of continue to expand that, schooling. And so with the PhD, we were just looking at how prescribed fire was influencing turkey populations. Particularly some of the landowners were concerned about growing season fires, so burning especially during the nesting period, and is that having negative influences on the turkey populations? And so we were addressing some of those questions in my research. And then after that, I finished up and started a postdoc position there at the University of Georgia Deer Research Lab. And so I worked on various research projects that were tied to the state agency. And so a lot of different questions that they were asking about, deer, population parameters and things like that around, North Georgia mountains, where you had a lot. It's a very mountainous area, and trying to address questions about hunter satisfaction and population declines of deer and things like that. And so, a lot of different projects I got to work on during my postdoc, and then that eventually led to the position that ended up coming here. And here it's been a great position to be able to get started, and especially tied to the topics of precision conservation. We'll talk about a little later on.
Very cool. Very cool.
Well, that's pretty impressive, Andrew. So your lab here at UNL, it's the AWESM lab, which stands for the Applied Wildlife Ecology and Spatial Movement Lab, right?
That's correct.
Could you tell us about the lab and some of the different topics that you are currently focused on?
Yeah, absolutely. So that acronym we just kind of term as the Awesome Lab. So that's kind of our acronym with that. So we are the Awesome Lab, truly the Awesome Lab. So yes, we really are very applied. And again, being especially an extension here at the university, working with our landowners, hearing questions, concerns that they may have, and then turning some of that into research projects. Obviously based on funding support and things like that. Really, so really the emphasis of our lab as a whole, kind of our mission, is we're really focused kind of this nexus of conservation and ag profitability. and looking at these production systems and thinking about how can we implement conservation practices, whether that's benefiting soils, water, wildlife, whatever. I tend to view myself as working a very broad array of different projects. And so I actually am partner currently with folks that are here in biological systems engineering and ag hort, other departments across campus.
Awesome.
Working on a variety of ag related questions, but then tying that back to our conservation efforts. And so we have projects really ranging from things talking about precision conservation to pronghorn in western Nebraska. We currently have a project with Nebraska Game and Parks Commission, where we've been putting GPS collars on pronghorn in western Nebraska, looking at their movements around that western Nebraska landscape. And so again, this is really a broad array of different projects, but again, they're very applied and addressing questions that producers, landowners have about conservation, and trying to find these kind of the middle ground opportunities to be able to manage really for both.
Sure. Yeah, and you kind of mentioned that nexus of agricultural production and profitability,
Sure.
Wildlife management, and land conservation. I mean, why do you think that it's so important to Nebraska and more broadly, and why is Nebraska kind of the right place to be doing this sort of research?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, obviously being here in the state of Nebraska, being 97% privately owned, we're working a lot with our landowners, and being such obviously an agriculturally dominated state, and there's been a lot of questions of, okay, things like how can I try to improve the overall crop profitability, the production side, but at the same time not, maybe put more nutrients on, or trying to managing those things more sustainably into the future. And so really Nebraska kind of sets itself up to be a perfect state to implement these ideas because of that ag dominated nature. And then finding ways again where we can kind of optimize not only that profitability for a producer, but thinking about other stackable enterprises for them, whether that's, producing, other areas for wildlife, which then could turn into maybe a business, a side business, like even like a lease, for example, hunting lease. Sure. So they can help, and again, maximizing the whole field profitability for themselves. So,
yeah, that's really cool.
That's cool, Andrew. And you also mentioned like a lot about this precision conservation. And with this being a digital agriculture focused podcast, we really like to focus on how data and digital tools influence the agricultural production and management. There is this emerging practice called precision conservation that leverage the data and digital tools. Would you mind defining the precision conservation for us?
Yeah, that's a great question. So precision conservation really as a whole is basically using spatial tools to help identify those consistently marginal areas where you could then in turn basically diversify your practices. And basically you're finding things using data sources like hydrography data, soil data, yield monitor data, et cetera. And we can kind of compile that into a framework where we can say these areas are consistently marginal and we want to take and diversify. So you may be more like a precision cover crop option. It could be a precision livestock option where we're putting a section of that into a pasture because we're not really producing much on that. So we're going to put something else there. Precision honey management. So in other words, like kind of putting areas precisely that section of the field into a lease or some other alternative option is kind of the point of it. And so it's really precision conservation really is birthed out of using precision ag tools, a lot of things that are readily available already to a landowner to help them identify those areas. And I'll be honest, a lot of producers know where those areas are. They know from year to year, like I know that area is just marginal. I'm not getting much out there. So therefore I'm going to reduce the population density of corn or soybean plants in that area. And so but then you're using the spatial data that we can actually map all that out. And then we can give them alternative options that you can put in here as something else to diversify. So,
yeah. And you kind of went ahead and provided an overview of some of those decisions that a producer might make using some of this data. But you also kind of alluded to, these are the options that we kind of put out there. Yeah. So I kind of want to dig into that decision-making process a little bit more. How would a farmer or a landowner look at this data and make these decisions? I mean, is it the level of decision-making detail that you say, maybe brome grass is like the right thing we need to put in this particular area? you know, or maybe this is an ideal area for livestock management, or is it just kind of, these are the different options that we have for this area, let's figure out what works for your operation?
Correct. Yeah, a lot of it ends up being more what works best for your operation, because as you know, everybody's going to be different. Every producer is going to have, you know, different capabilities. And so, you know, from a standpoint of if I can put cattle or not, or if I can put a certain cover crop or not, those type of things. And so, you know, really it comes down to kind of giving people kind of like I kind of view it as almost like a smorgasbord of different options. And then you can say, here, pick what best fits for your needs and your, you know, capabilities for your land. And then also knowing that every field's going to be different too. You know, you may have one field that you're doing this, and then another field you're doing something totally different. And that's the thing, is you're leveraging the variation of those fields with the whole intent is to maximize that overall farm profitability as a whole. So
no, that makes a lot of sense, I think.
Yeah, and you also mentioned like that some farmers, they already know some areas that they are having low yields or whatever, so they can decrease the population, everything. But how often does this practice of precision conservation are being used nowadays?
Yeah, so that's another great question. I would say right now, with precision conservation, it's really kind of at the earlier stage of adoption. One, just because there's a lot of questions around the tools available to make those decisions. You know, there's not been a lot of tools available essentially. And so from a producer standpoint, I think Dr. Joe Luck had put together a study here a few years ago and looked at kind of adoptability of precision ag practices in the state. And really kind of, as he says, it kind of bends it into three groups. You have producers that may not be interested in this type of technology, people who are very progressive and are using it on a day-to-day basis, but really a kind of larger contingent that are in the middle that are, I like to use it, but there's a lot of steps that are in the middle and I'm trying to make decisions, you know, and I may not have somebody to help me with doing that. And so that's where, you know, we're hoping in the future that we can continue to develop those type of tools that can, and working with landowners. And that's where, you know, in my opinion, it's incredibly valuable to actually talk with those landowners and get their perspectives on, you know, these tools. Because at the end of the day, we can develop these tools, these kind of theoretical ideas and things and put all this together. But if you can't get it adopted, that's a whole nother challenge. And so it really, to me, especially being an extension realm, is actually bringing people together and from various walks of life and kind of saying, how can we move this forward? Like, what are some of the things that we need to be thinking about to make this applicable to you as a producer, a landowner in the state?
Absolutely. And I think we want to definitely touch on kind of that stakeholder participation practice a little bit later on in the interview, but just kind of thinking about this adoption piece. And you brought up that study from the past 3 years. I mean, considering kind of our ag landscape right now, we've been thinking a lot about farm profitability over the past few years. You know, we had some pretty low corn prices here a couple years ago, but now we're in this area where we've got really high nitrogen prices, and we also have high corn prices. We've got just a lot of stuff that's going on the farm profitability front. How is that kind of driving people's interest in these technologies and potentially even the adoption?
Yeah, that's another great question. I would say it really is, again, because it's so new, it's been, you know, probably somewhat limited adoption thus far, but it's growing in interest. There's a lot of people that are wanting to do this as they're seeing fluctuations in the market and trying to, you know, diversify their operations. But that's one of the big things too, is that the industry is really kind of, you know, drives a lot of that. And so if you're, like you said, your corn prices are up or your nitrogen prices are up, like you said right now, you know, that obviously going to affect whether or not I'm going to make a decision, you know, should I or not adopt this conservation or this other type of practice. And historically, you know, from some of the work that I've seen, especially with precision conservation, where I've seen more of like maybe a conservation reserve program focus. I've kind of taken a little different approach in it and kind of saying, you know, CRP is a really good way to kind of think about that, but also thinking about alternatives, because at the end of the day, CRP, there's only so much money there. And so what other options exist for a producer? Can it be, you know, hunting leases or grazing lands or whatever to kind of break up the, you know, kind of the monocultural systems, especially when you have these, you know, marginal areas where you're really not making much on. So.
And I guess before we dive into the next question, that's a really interesting point, because I've heard a lot of growers bring up, you know, CRP and enrolling in the CRP program. Could you maybe get into a little bit more detail on what the differences are between like just enrolling in a CRP and what the potential benefits are of more of these, I guess, maybe higher ceiling profitability practices?
Yeah. So, you know, particularly from the CRP, I think that really, you know, I think I kind of put them all honestly in the same bucket per se of like, you know, various ones could really increase your overall profitability. So, not saying that CRP cannot, because obviously it can, but it's like really the strategic implementation.
Where
and that's where, where it should go. And then also thinking about, okay, CRP could be one option of multiple options that you could think about. But then the end goal of all of that is sustainability, conservation of that area, particularly of that field. And so that's your end goal. However, you have different, means to get to that end. CRP is one of them. So it's not to negate that CRP is not important, because that obviously is incredibly important. But it's thinking about, is there other options beyond CRP to help benefit that in the long term? And that's where I think that you can, implement these other types of ideas of, like, a great example, hunting lease example. One of my colleagues, Dr. Martin McConnell, who's down at Mississippi State University, had mentioned this in the past, that he had a producer, a fairly well-known producer in the state of Mississippi, where they had a section of his field that was regularly inundated with water along the Mississippi River. Well, basically, it didn't make a lot of sense to keep every year planting that if it was constantly getting flooded out. And so what they did is they basically kind of, essentially chopped that section of the field off, leased that out to waterfowl hunters, and they were actually able to maximize overall profitability.
Sure.
Now, that's one option. Could you put it into maybe a wetland conservation program? Absolutely. So there's different ways to kind of look at that. And I think that's where there's opportunities moving forward from a tool development to kind of help producers get the suite of options that exist, and then let them decide what makes the most sense. Saying here's 5-10 options or whatever. You decide what makes the most sense given your practice. And again, like we talked about earlier, it's like that may differ from one field to the next. So
awesome. Yeah.
And since you guys been working directly with these producers, we would like to know what data type are crucial to help these guys to apply these precision conservation techniques.
Yeah, so a lot of the data that we have that we can utilize is publicly available data. So things like slope or elevation data, hydrography types of data sets. The other thing that has been obviously a real popular now is getting yield monitor data to build into that. And that's where, I mentioned earlier about Dr. Martin McConnell. They actually have developed a tool, particularly tied to CRP programs, to basically identify, one, what is eligible, what acres in your field are actually eligible for a suite of different conservation programs, and then taking that a step further and tying that to the yield monitor data, because then you can have an entire field, you have sections of that are eligible, but at the end of the day, there's only so much money that you can enroll sections of that field in. Well, where do I really want to target that enrollment? So we kind of even think about, Iowa State and the prairie strips program. So we kind of think about establishing prairie strips, maybe on the downhill slope of an area. So as that soil is getting washed down, it's getting stopped by the prairie grass that are there to kind of hold that up, so it's not then running down into the neighboring stream. And so again, it's kind of thinking strategically using those spatial data sets. And that's, again, so a lot of that's available. The yield monitor data, that's obviously producer dependent to be able to get that stuff. So, but again, we're really honestly still in that kind of that new novel phase right now, where we're still trying to figure out like how this is all going to play out. And we're hoping that, with demonstration sites across the state, that we'll be able to start illustrating this to producers in a larger spatial scale.
Yeah. And how have you run into any challenges in terms of like data quality and availability of yield monitor data as you're starting to get into this? Or
yeah, the one challenge I know, like yield monitor data obviously has to be cleaned up, and so that takes time. And there are obviously programs out there like Yield SMS that can help with that. Right. But that stuff takes time to go through all that and clean everything up and get it to kind of a quality data set to work through. But a lot of the publicly available data sets, like your elevation, slope, all that kind of stuff, that stuff has been kind of tried and true data sets for years on end. So again, it's really kind of leveraging these various data sources in a way that's going to be a positive for the producers.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
And do you believe that there is a place for a digital assessment tool that would allow farmers to perform an initial assessment of their land to determine if it could be benefit from implementing the conservation? Or
that absolutely. So that's where I would like to go in the near future, is to kind of really get tools in the hands of our landowners, our producers, so that they can, essentially play around with the data and kind of decide, since we have a lot of publicly available data, and then it's their yield monitor data that they can pull into the programming side of things. And then they can kind of say, here's some different options and kind of here's some cost analyses. And there are different companies that are trying to push to get stuff like that. And again, I mentioned Dr. Mark McConnell earlier. He developed one more tied to CRP practices. But again, the hope is in the future, we can there's a lot of variables. That's the problem. There's a lot of variables to throw into it and create a framework that can be beneficial to various different options out there. Because costs are going to change, and there's a lot of different, differences across the state, from a rain gradient side of things that are going to likely affect your decision making as a producer. So
absolutely. And so you've kind of mentioned that there are some companies that they're potentially looking to get into this space. And I think about, people like, or I should say groups like Ducks Unlimited or Pheasants Forever. Sure. I mean, what is their role in this space? Are they some of the people that are looking at potentially trying to build some of these tools out? Or?
Yeah. So a really good one is Pheasants Forever. So they actually, they have their director over in Iowa, Ryan Henniger, who's a producer over there and also works on basically the director of the Precision Ag program. And basically he oversees kind of, a lot of their precision ag biologists they have across the country. And we more locally, Nathan Pfluger, who was actually a graduate here of UNL, got his master's in agronomy and horticulture just a couple of years ago. He is now the precision ag specialist for Pheasants Forever. And basically he's actually based out of the York area. Okay. And so that's basically part of his job is to kind of identify, right now, one of the tools I know that Pheasants Forever has used in the past was working with, or one of the companies I should say, is Ag Solver. That's been one of the companies that they've used in the past. And so using companies like that, or even things like, again, with Mark's tool eventually coming out here and kind of be able to utilize things along those lines to work then directly with the producer, kind of serving almost like in a liaison type role. Yeah. Because again, some of these tools, can be complicated and
you need an advisor.
And so you need to kind of have an advisor there to help you through the process to do that. And that's kind of the hope, is to kind of build that infrastructure, especially from my extension side of things, is then do workshops and training events with landowners. And once we get some more of these tools available, to walk them through how they can actually do a lot of this on their own. So then it really kind of turns it over to them to make the decisions and play around with options, try to create kind of user-friendly options for them in that decision making.
Sure. Yeah.
So, yeah. And it's really interesting because it seems that we have a lot of variables involved on this precision conservation, like you said. And here I have a question more about there seems to be a fairly significant element of the sociology and also the psychology that impacts the adoption of these precision technologies as well. Could you expand a little bit for us on that?
Yeah, well, and so really kind of speaks to the complexities of this issue. There is no silver bullet in adopting conservation practices, and really there's no silver bullet in really anything in life. It's just a matter of fact. There's a lot of pros and cons to things, and I have 2 graduate students right now that are working on a Nebraska Environmental Trust funded grant that are basically asking the questions about basically farmers and farmland owners' adoption of targeted conservation or precision conservation practices. And basically kind of addressing not only the side of the landowners, because obviously that's really one of the most fundamental groups, but then also asking our conservation folks as well. And then kind of finding, are there, issues there, maybe kind of discrepancies between the 2 different groups and how messages are getting out, and kind of how to move forward. And I think one of the things from kind of like the sociology side of things is you're thinking about a landowner and then obviously their peers within an area. And so the ideal scenario that I've heard has worked really well in past for various options is having somebody that's well known in your community that is able to adopt some of these practices and then be able to kind of let them kind of lead teaching others. So then it's not necessarily back on the researcher, the extension person. It really comes down to somebody that maybe have lived in that community for 100 years, their family. And so they can work with them and kind of ask them questions like, how did this work for you? Like, what did you do here? What did you do there, kind of thing. So it really kind of puts it on then the producers in those neighborhoods to kind of sell those options moving forward. So, but again, there definitely is a component of that sociology kind of thing and psychology, kind of thinking through, the complexities that I have, taxes being another challenge here in the state for producers, kind of saying, well, hey, if I, maybe take this out of production and put this in a conservation program, then I may lose the cropping history on that. And then that may cause other problems down the road from a tax implication standpoint. And so how do I navigate that? And that's where I think, with our stuff in our lab, we're really trying to focus on those realms of how can we identify the major barriers to adoption. That's really what the emphasis of this project is from a producer standpoint. And then from the conservation standpoint, the folks, how can we then work with them to address these barriers? We know there's going to be barriers. What are those barriers? And how can we kind of develop tools to address those concerns that producers may have? Because that's really going to end up, if you have pretty significant barriers, you're going to basically affect adoption of practices like this. So
Sure.
Yeah. And kind of as we're getting into this stakeholder discussion, I think the stakeholder discussion is something we need to talk about a little bit more within digital ag, because, even just on the digital ag side, I think it's actually a little bit simpler on the digital ag side, because to some extent you really only have a farmer, their advisor, and maybe their core network of advisors, right? And to some extent you have the NRDs maybe at play. But here you've got, you have a lot of different tax decisions, like you just mentioned. You have landowners that also have to kind of participate in these decisions, in addition to the farmers that are, managing it. You've got the NRDs, you got your Pheasants Forever people, you have NRCS, right? So it's a very complex group. Plus you have the outdoorsman if you start bringing in hunting license, right? So like, how do you navigate these complex conversations, and how do you also build tools that, kind of provide people the information?
Well, it's complex, not easy. Right? I will say that it's not easy for such a complex set of issues per se, but really try to simplify things as much as we can. We actually have a grant right now. It's a precision conservation grant. It's a through the University of Nebraska system, focused on basically developing a series of structured decision making workshops where we bring in producers, conservation folks, ag industry folks, et cetera, to just talk about conservation in agricultural landscapes, barriers to adoption, challenges. How can we, even in a smaller group, kind of work through, implementing future sustainable practices, and really kind of getting that core group to discuss those, barriers. And our hope is, through that grant, that'll kind of lead into maybe another grant down the road where we can kind of expand on more some of these questions about, from a barrier perspective, what are some innovative approaches to address that, constant barrier of X, Y, or Z for a producer and their adoption of that? Because that really, it's kind of like goes back to the precision ag data sets that Joe, with that project a few years ago. It's like, you have this technology coming out, but it ends up a lot of times boiling down to the tools, the techniques to be able to go through. And that's, as Joe always talks about, it's a very complex thing. It's not a super easy thing because everybody's going to have slightly different issues with their farms versus another. And from a programming standpoint, that complexity makes it difficult. But I will say, though, the positive is that you have like groups like Pheasants Forever that have really invested in this precision ag realm, especially with their biologists like Nathan Pfluger, to say this is very important. We know this is direction of future ag and using these type of technologies. And so therefore, we're going to invest in trying to create, tools and basically have people there to kind of help and, facilitating the dissemination of those tools and answering questions and trying to, again, one tool we come out with is not going to solve everything. So constantly learning, getting the feedback from the landowners, the producers, and saying, hey, what other options do we need to consider to develop into this tool, this framework? And then you hit on another really important point, especially in Nebraska. I know a lot of other Midwest states that have basically these landowners, essentially they're absentee or basically are folks that are not around. They may live in a different state. Maybe they live there and they lease it out to a different group of producers. And so that basically creates another challenge. Because you have two different groups now. You may have, and I've heard this from producers, is I like the ideas of precision conservation, but I'm a little concerned that maybe that would lead to losing my lease on ground, and I want to kind of keep that. And so that's obviously another barrier, and we basically are working through, or especially our environmental trust grant, trying to address that component, so we can kind of start seeing like how can we work around some of those challenges that landowners are bringing up to us. So.
Sure. And just as a follow-up real quick, the outdoorsman element of this, I think is really interesting.
For sure.
And I know I have a bunch of friends who hunt, and they talk about using like Onyx, right? Like as one of their apps to go to. And obviously that's collecting geospatial data, got plenty of maps. Is there any opportunity to use any of that I guess almost I'd call it like hunting data, right? To integrate into any of this stuff, determine productivity of hunting leases or anything like that?
There could be. That's something I haven't really seen much explored yet with that, but I definitely think that's a possibility. And I think that, more tools like that could be really helpful to, tie in the profitability component. And that's where like, the discussion right now of, if I take like maybe an X number of acres that are marginal and put it into a hunting lease, what are the economics on that? You know, and if compared to if I just kept it at a, my current, management, traditional management.
Yeah.
And so that's where our hope in the future, working with NREC, our Eastern Nebraska Research Extension Center, and other research extension centers across the state, we can roll some of these ideas out and show these as demonstration sites. We'll then hopefully facilitate even, further even on-farm demonstrations of other producers across the state expanding on this. But again, it's like I said, it's relatively new area. There's a lot of questions around it, a lot of complexity, and that's been, the challenge of trying to work through this. But again, it is really, I think we have the opportunity to really kind of simplify some of these things to certain levels, and kind of you can't kind of take and tackle it all, tackle little pieces and kind of work through them and then go from there.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. Sorry, I keep cutting you off.
No, that's fine.
You want me to take the next
Yeah.
one? All right. So we've kind of talked about all these different tools, but a lot of it's been focused on, all right, I have a single quarter section, or I have a single field, right? And I want to convert part of it into this, hunting lease, or maybe I want to put part of it in CRP.
Yep.
We also, we know that wildlife don't really like stay in one area, at least like a lot of them don't, right?
Yeah,
and so you kind of need to look at, I guess, more regional scale practices. So, and I know your lab group's kind of been getting into some of this sort of more regional scale research. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Yeah. So you really, I kind of think of, because I also focus a lot on landscape ecology, and not like the landscaping we're out planting plants around our house, more about like different scales and how the landscape is laid out and how the patches are laid out in the landscape. And I think a lot about this. We have a project right now with Game and Parks. It's a pheasant project. And so, some of the questions that landowners have asked us, like, well, hey, how can I think about, even at a broader scale, about, improving the conditions for pheasant populations in my area, not just my one individual field, but, my neighbors, and, and kind of building out like a ripple in a pond type of effect. And that's where really the regional analyses, kind of these, I kind of call them like a multi-scale analysis, where you're looking at like, it can kind of come in all different forms, but you could say like, I want to look at, multiple properties within, say, a 5 square mile area, and what look at the profitability amongst those properties, and then where potential adoption opportunities, and then how could we, if we implemented certain practices here or there, how that would actually influence, population abundances. Again, a lot of that ends up being more, population dynamics and estimating things. But again, that's an opportunity where I know even from a state agency side, there's been questions not only here in Nebraska, but even across the United States, is, okay, we have a limited pot of money. Where at even a regional scale do we really kind of surgically target, our dollars most strategically? Is there ways that we can do that? Is there tools that we can do that? And that's where we have another student who's in a different lab, who's basically a PhD student working on some of that, kind of even at a regional scale, and bringing in our National Commodity Crop Productivity Index, NCCPI, pulling that data set in, and then looking at, kind of even at a regional scale, how that ties into yield monitor data in particular. Is it accurate? Is it not? What kind of tweaks need to be made for the future? But then even, from an agency using that at a regional scale, are there certain fields that, or certain producers that we can kind of work with to be able to say, hey, you may have some marginal grounds that, could be, put into some diversified practices. So that's an example. The other thing I also would say, with the pheasants, that's been a question, especially as farming practices obviously have changed over time. And I have a lot of producers, especially ones who are older, who, talk about, in the 50s and 60s, where they had really good pheasant populations, to now we see our numbers really declining quite a bit, especially in this part of the state. Are asking questions like, how do we get pheasants back? And obviously that's a very loaded question, very complicated question, because there are a lot of factors that go into that. But at the end of the day, pheasants are a big deal. It was estimated a couple of years ago that pheasant hunting as a whole is about a $32 million annual business to the state of Nebraska. And that obviously that money is trickling down to local communities where hunters are going to stay at a Airbnb or a hotel and eating at the local eateries around town and investing in those local communities. And so really, with that type of impact, that economic impact, thinking about how the landscape is laid out and looking at how where patches are laid out in the landscape, we can create, in my mind, kind of these ecotourism opportunities. So so maybe you have a suite of properties that have more wetland areas, for example. Maybe that's an opportunity for waterfowl hunters. So it's not just you, the landowner, it could be you and your neighbors. So you kind of develop, it's like, absolutely, that's exactly what it is. It's basically, and I kind of call that like a conservation co-op. And so it's kind of grouping multiple properties together. And maybe everybody has slightly different objectives, and that's totally fine. There's nothing wrong with that, but you can have a common goal of, hey, we want to do X, Y, and Z on our properties. And a great example of this, we can go to kind of the ranching side of things and think about the Schweitzer Ranch, which is in the Sandhills. And they obviously, be a more production cattle system. But then they said, well, hey, what about diversifying and doing some other things on our property? And so they started doing that. And now they're seeing additional streams of income coming in. The great part about all that, these additional streams of income, is that you can also then help from those years that you may have a lower dollar per bushel. You can help offset those years that are maybe, or you have a drought year or whatever.
It's kind of a stabilizing.
Correct. Yeah. So these are alternative options. So
interesting. Okay. Very, very cool.
Following up a little bit on the regional scale experiments that you guys been doing, how does cropping system diversity or lack of it impact the feasibility or implementing best practice for this precision conservation?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So really, in my mind, that because again, it is pretty complex. There's a lot of pieces to go into that. We are kind of looking at, even at that regional scale of, okay, if we focus on, say, we kind of use Southeast Nebraska as a great example, because we have obviously a lot of dryland acres down here. And we think at a regional scale where we have obviously a lot, just primarily a corn bean rotation, what other options were, kind of from a theoretical standpoint, we're kind of looking through of, could we implement that could still have a good economic return for a producer, but even in a broader spatial extent. So not just the field, but like multiple producers within an area. And I think part of what, kind of getting at with that is when I'm starting to look at it from a wildlife perspective, because that's, again, my training as a wildlife biologist, I'm kind of looking at connectivity of patches and things like that. When you look, I used an example in the past in presentation in Odo County, so just in the neighboring county here, and looking at the fragmentation of our, grassland patches versus just, regular ag patches. And you can see the fragmentation of these really limited patches. Obviously, there are some clumps here and there, but most of them are pretty dispersed. And the question there is, if you're a pheasant, for example, how do you get from point A to point B? One of the things that's been discussed a lot in the past, okay, well, when the crops are up, that provides obviously some refugia that, to get from point A to point B. But what happens in the wintertime, those cold months when there's not much cover out there? Now you're really fragmenting that population down to very limited areas, which tends to be why you see higher abundances of pheasants in, say, Southwest Nebraska, McCook area, et cetera. Because they have a lot more diversity in the sense of like CRP, and they have, the farming, soil rental rates are obviously lower out there versus over here. And so that diversity there kind of helps facilitate, higher pheasant abundances versus more of a monocultural system. And when you don't have cover there. And another thing we've been talking a lot about too is, what role does cover crops, especially winter cover crops, play there in wildlife movements across the landscape? Because that could be a very, successful, venture if we have the right mixes of cover crops in a landscape that again are not only beneficial for the wildlife, but are also beneficial from that producer and their needs. But again, when I kind of zoom all that out and kind of look at that regional scale, it's the monocultures that obviously does create some challenges from a wildlife movement standpoint when you have, limited diversity. But obviously diversity, the way things are set up are obviously for a reason, because the industry is just, that's kind of a big part of the industry right now and the needs. But I think moving forward from a sustainable ag practice, there are alternative options as well. But that also creates the need for markets for things like that. And that's why I know there's been a lot of discussion in carbon sequestration and other things along those lines is a whole nother topic area, because that's, thinking about alternatives into the future. So,
yeah. No, there's so much that goes into this, from the cover crops, and I'm sure even perennial crops is something that you can start thinking about. And y'all are probably starting to get excited about as those markets start
to
explode. But I guess as we start to get towards the end of this interview, because we may have to have you on again just to talk about more of this stuff. But
glad to come back on.
That'd be awesome. But getting to the end here, looking futuristically, if you were to kind of imagine some tools that would really help with building out conservation, precision conservation, whether that's database tools, whether that's data acquisition tools, or whether that's literally a digital tool that kind of brings it all together. What would you like to see here in the next few years for precision conservation?
Yeah, I think for me, I would really like to see some tools where we can actually using, on the ground experiments at, say, our research and extension centers to kind of feed in some data in initially to these, where basically we can look at different scenarios, kind of like scenario planning. I guess that's a better way to put it. So you're basically putting in, if I did X, then what is the likely response economically? Because bottom line, that's what it's going to come down to from a decision point. Is it affordable or not? And so that's my vision, is to be able to then get this input to the producers to say, okay, yeah, if I tried scenario 1 versus 2 versus 3, what are the cost benefits for all those 3 options? And what makes the most sense on my ground? And that's where I think too is, again, we can develop these tools, but the training, the workshops, engaging with our landowners to really kind of put them in the driver's seat, in my mind, to let them make those decisions for their properties. So then it kind of lets them decide, like, what works best, what works best for the bottom line. Obviously, I think in the near term, you're still going to need to have a lot of it, kind of advisement there. And maybe at some point, down the road, 10 years or so down the road, we'll be able to have it where it's totally like you kind of do everything yourself.
Right.
And I know there's an emphasis, there's an interest in doing that. So it's really kind of puts it on the producers to let them make their own decisions of what works best for their system. So that's really, I think for me, it's trying to, having the data sets, as data sources, I should say, are available, that are already publicly available, and then letting the producer pull in things like yield monitor data, which is just a really great resource that they're collecting a lot of times on their combines, and they can pull that in themselves and then have a user-friendly option, or user-friendly kind of like GUI interface where it's a point and click, and then make those decisions on what financial scenario makes the most sense.
Sure.
So that's my vision, to see where we can go with that. And hopefully, as we continue to build this research, I think the other thing too I'll add is that in addition to the tools, is really building in that human dimensions component. So really, and you talked about psychology and sociology, that's really important as well in this discussion, and thinking about the tool development, but how people are wanting to adopt this. Like, is there, influences from their peers one way or another on the ground to implement or not implement some of these diversified practices? And how does that influence, the decision making? And even to the point where, there's been discussions in the past, like, could you move towards, if you have maybe you have parcels A, B, and C, and you're the parcel B, and you don't have much connectivity to A and C, or the farm in the middle, maybe there's a higher incentive rates that could be offered to adopt certain practices, even from like a federal government side of things, like a CRP type program. Has been something that's been discussed in the past. Whether that happens or not, I don't know. We'll see how it goes in the future. But there's a lot of ideas out there to kind of think through. And I think the exciting thing to me is that precision conservation is really an awesome way to think about diversifying operations, the landscape, and thinking about the how we can kind of think about sustainability and really optimizing ag profitability and sustainability at the same time.
Awesome.
And for farmers, landowners, advisor, or whoever is listening to this podcast, and they are thinking about the few spots on their fields that's not yielding good, or something like on these lines, how would you recommend that they get started assessing these options that we mentioned today? Yeah, so I would say the best option right now is to get in touch most directly would be Nathan Pfluger with Precision Pheasant Forever, with his Precision Ag role there, because that's basically that's his position to do that. So as well as NRCS, other agencies that are engaged in this realm, because I think a lot of these agencies realize that, their organizations realize it's kind of a great way to really optimize both. And so that would be, from my recommendation, is they would reach out to your local FSA office to see what options exist. One of the projects we're just getting started, I want to go ahead and note here, is with the Iowa State and their prairie strips program. And basically what they do is they take about 10% of a corn bean field and put that into prairie strips. And basically that prairie strip is there to really kind of help from that sustainability, from like the soil erosion, water loss, benefits to wildlife, et cetera.
And really, so what we partnered with them on is to, basically bring that to Nebraska and basically kind of expand the footprint of prairie strips across Nebraska. And so here in the near future, we have an extension driven project that we're going to be rolling that out, basically hopefully with some landowners across the state, but also, with our research and extension centers to actually demonstrate, here's another option, that you could think about is putting a prairie strip on your property. And that's actually in the Conservation Reserve Program at CP 43. So producers actually can enroll in that right now. I've heard of some producers in particular up in the northeast part of the state that are enrolling in that right now. And so they want it, and their end goal was, particularly one of the producers I've talked with some of the biologists about is, hey, I really want to create options for my kids to be able, or grandkids to come in here and pheasant hunt. Yeah. And I don't have that right now. And so this seems like a viable option. And these are some marginal acres that I'm not really making much on, or maybe they're on terraces or whatever, that, maybe my equipment can't get around anymore. And so that's an alternative option that then the producer is able to get some, economic returns from the program, but then also have that, benefit for their kids, grandkids, et cetera. So
sure. So if there's a producer out there, like the guy you're talking about, who's interested in doing something like this, maybe they're interested in the prairie strip program, where can they go to learn more about you, what you're doing, and some of the programs that you have available for producers here in the state? Yeah.
So for me, as a, obviously researcher, extension person, the programs I would put more on the FSA and NRCS, since I don't run that stuff, but from the standpoint of, our research and extension efforts, they can go to our lab, which is the Applied Wildlife Ecology and Spatial Movement Lab. So you can just type in wildlifeecology.unl.edu and you can go there and visit our website and learn more about our projects, our extension efforts that we're doing with these efforts. And so again, it's a great resource. But again, if you're a listener and you're out there wanting to think about prairie strips as an example, or other precision conservation practices, you have your FSA office, with your NRS or NRCS. And then also you have, Nathan Pfluger with precision as a precision ag specialist here in the state. So there's a lot of great, state, NGO, federal resources that are available that you can contact to be able to address some conservation options that are out there in the landscape.
Sure. Yeah.
And Andrew, do you have a last piece of advice to offer our listeners when it comes to land management and wildlife conservation efforts?
Yeah, I'd say, I think from my perspective, is to kind of think through like what options, could you look at on your property for the sustainability in the future? And I'd say one story that I think really kind of hit me from a producer up in the northeast part of the state that really kind of emphasized the importance of, precision conservation efforts is the producer. I listened to my presentation in a meeting a while back and came up afterwards and said he owned quite a few acres in the northeast part of the state. And basically just said that, from my perspective, I'm looking at future generations, my kids, grandkids, et cetera, that are going to own this farm. And I've lost soil, obviously, on my fields. And so I'm thinking about the prairie strip program as an option, to help reduce that into the future and that sustainability. And so it was really, to me, it kind of hit me as a really exciting moment, because it basically said, well, the producer was kind of thinking through this kind of the long term, because we live really, as I always kind of tell people, we live in kind of the microwave generation. Conservation really ends up being a long-term investment. It's not like getting on our phone and pulling something up on Google. We can have it instantaneous. It takes time. And so, kind of thinking about that long-term effect, of conservation in the landscape, why should we do it? And again, from that producer's perspective, it just really hit me as like, that's great to hear, because at the end of the day, that's somebody who's really investing into the future, long before, after I should say, they're gone, and, thinking about that, future farm essentially. So yeah, I'd say that's really think about the longevity of the resources out there you have. And I'm excited to see, people starting to adopt these techniques and approaches, and as we move into the future.
Thank you very much to Dr. Little for taking the time to join us for this episode of the FarmBits podcast. It's really exciting to see how technology is improving precision conservation. And one of my favorite parts of this episode was how people are adopting new practices towards precision conservation, and how this practice can impact our future generations in different ways.
Yeah, it was really interesting, kind of hearing some stories about farmers in northeast Nebraska and how they're already thinking about those next generations and how to sustain their farms for the future. One of the things I thought was really interesting discussing was all the different stakeholder groups that are involved within precision conservation between landowners, farmers, NRCS, and all the different psychological elements that kind of go into these adoption decisions. So, and kind of how they're thinking about integrating these individual tools. I think it's a really, really interesting aspect of what Dr. Little's lab is doing across the board. So yeah, I thought it was a great episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Tune in to listen. We look forward to you joining us next week as we bring another story about visual agriculture.
Thank you for taking the time to join us today on the FarmBits podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you're listening to podcasts to be informed about the latest content each week.
We welcome your feedback. So if you have comments or questions for us, please reach out to us on email, on Twitter, or in the review section of your favorite podcast platform. Our contact information can be found in the show notes.
We would like to thank Nebraska State for their support of this podcast and their commitment to providing high-quality information and material to members of the agricultural community in Nebraska.
The opinions expressed by the hosts and guests on this podcast